Washington Journal continues.
Melanie Sloan is back at our table this morning, Executive Director of the Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, here to mark the 4th anniversary of the Supreme Court decision in Citizens United versus the FEC. Melanie Sloan, let me show you the tweet from Citizens United this morning. It says, "Today marks the 4th anniversary of our victory for free speech at the Supreme Court."
Well, what I'd say is it marks the victory of anonymous money funneled into our political system to fund vitriolic political ads.
What has been the impact? Talk a little bit more. I mean, what have you seen since the 2010 decision?
Well, what we've seen since 2010 is more and more money going into our political system, most of it anonymous. There are organizations called 501c4s, which are social welfare organizations, which were started initially in order to promote the social welfare. But now what we've seen is political people creating these 501c4s simply to allow donors to anonymously give their money, and then these groups, which have very innocuous sounding names like the American Future Fund and Crossroads, things you'd have no idea who's really behind any of these organizations, and they're funding nasty political ads, very destructive in our political system, but really we have no idea who's funding all of this.
Explain what the Supreme Court decided.
Well, what the Supreme Court decided in Citizens United was that they based it on an older Supreme Court case, Buckley versus Vallejo. Then they said that money is speech and that corporations have the right to speech, basically. So while in the past there had been a ban on corporate treasury funds and union funds being spent, given to candidates directly, that was struck down. So I'm sorry, not to giving the candidates directly, giving the money to soft money, what we call. That was what was struck down. And what we've seen as a result of this, some of the things that we're seeing now actually were already legal, actually, before Citizens United. But Citizens United really sort of opened the floodgates. It really changed a mental impression, I think, that people had about what you could and couldn't do in our electoral system. So while there was some use of these groups, 501c4s, previous to Citizens United, we really saw this open the doors to a whole new start of political funding. We've also seen now candidate-specific organizations, what we call super PACs, were funded in the wake of Citizens United. And these super PACs, and those do disclose their donors, but candidates have not just their own candidate campaign committees anymore, but now they also have these candidate-specific super PACs, which are, although are allegedly supposed to be independent and not coordinate with each other, in fact, generally have staff that are very close to the candidates themselves, and it's hard to say that they're not coordinating. And these groups spend way more money. So one of the big things that we've seen as a result of all this is both candidates and the party committees have less control over the message than they did pre-Citizens United, because there's all of this money flowing into the system where these can start all these groups and say whatever you want.
Reason.com had 5 ways Citizens United makes politics better after the 2010 decision. They wrote this in 2012, but still applies. They said that not so long ago, as recently as 2008, in fact, the only non-anointed candidate for president capable of staying in a primary race over the long haul was Representative Ron Paul. That would almost certainly have been the case this year for former Speaker Newt Gingrich and former Pennsylvania Senator Rick Santorum, had the Supreme Court voted to uphold campaign speech and finance restrictions in 2010. It's an open question how much of the nation's political consciousness is being raised by having Santorum and Gingrich in the race, but having both men in the race has forced Romney to defend his positions and explain the many inconsistencies in his record. It's a more competitive primary process with Citizens United.
But really, that isn't true. I mean, Rick Santorum and Newt Gingrich are terrific examples because those people were both in the race because they each had one incredibly rich supporter. Newt Gingrich had Sheldon Adelson, and Rick Santorum had Foster Friess. And without those single donors, those two candidates wouldn't have been able to stay in the race. And previously, before Citizens United, candidates who didn't have widespread support wouldn't be able to stay in the race. So when we're talking about there's more speech for the billionaires, multimillionaires, and corporations. But for the vast number of people, there's far less speech, and you end up having people like Santorum and Gingrich stay in the race.
Reason says not true, that this had allowed interest groups to break free from party dependency. They say, imagine a world where union bosses were no longer controlled by the Democrats, where even Occupy Wall Street could form its own super PAC. Citizens United, by underscoring a right to pool resources for political expression, has made it easier for politically engaged Americans to influence the political process.
I think I would buy some of that a little more if it wasn't that most of the people who are funding the political process now are trying to stay anonymous. So we really have no idea who's behind many of these candidates, and Americans can't put the ads that they see into context. If you knew, for example, that Exxon was funding an ad against a member of Congress running for re-election who was pro-environmental regulation, you might take that as a very different perspective than you see it if the American Action Network, which you don't know anything about, is running the ad.
So what's being done by you and other groups to try to overturn or get new laws on the books in reaction to Citizens United versus FEC?
Well, there's so many efforts going on at once. There's a group of people who are pushing very hard for a constitutional amendment to say that corporations, for example, don't have free speech rights, that corporations are not people, which is one of the big things that has come up as a result of Citizens United. Secondly, we have something called the Disclose Act that has had some support, widespread support from Democrats, not much support from Republicans, that would require more disclosure about the donors to these kinds of funds. And then people are looking at different kinds of areas to work in. Crew, for example, recently filed a lawsuit against Aetna. Aetna is a major insurance company that claimed it was revealing its political expenditures on these political contribution reports that they post on their website. But in reality, many of the contributions that Aetna was making were not included in those political contribution reports. So we've sued over that. There are other people who are pushing with the SEC to change regulations so that shareholders would have a right to know about the political contributions. So there's many efforts on many fronts.
By the way, on the constitutional amendment, here's People for the American Way. They're part of this group. They say 16 states and around 500 cities and towns have called for a constitutional amendment to overturn the Citizens United decision. And then the third metric on Huffington Post had this posted on January 13th, that there are 8 ways to help overturn Citizens United. A national lobbying day in D.C. National groups plan to get together today. People for the American Way, U.S. PIRG, Public Campaign, Public Citizen hold a lobbying day on Capitol Hill today. Let's get to phone calls. Manchester, Connecticut, independent caller. Alec, you're up first. Go ahead.
Good morning. How you guys doing? I love the show. Melanie, how are you?
Nice to see you.
I'd just like to know, well, researchers have recently discovered through Freedom of Information Act requests that NIST omitted important elements of Building 7's design, the third tower that fell on 9/11, which wasn't hit by a plane, and that if NIST had properly included these elements in their data, the explanation for Building 7's fall would have been impossible. Now that attorney Dr. William Pepper has written to the Department of Commerce demanding accountability from NIST over this, would you be willing to read his letter and consider having your organization review this issue?
Well, you can please feel free to send us the letter at info@citizensforethics.org, and we'll certainly take a look.
Is that something that you guys look into, or is it mostly money in politics?
We do mostly money in politics and congressional ethics issues, but we also use the Freedom of Information Act a significant amount to obtain information from the government that it might not want to share.
Tom in Fontana, Wisconsin, Republican caller. Hi, Tom.
Yes, your guest is such a far left-wing guest. It's unbelievable. You should once in a while have a guest to balance out what she's saying.
Well, stay tuned, Tom. We will. We're coming up next. We're going to get the other side.
Well, yesterday when you were in the host, you had 3 liberals on in a row. So thank you if you're going to have a conservative on for a change when you're hosting. But anyway, this woman is such a far left-wing prop. It's unbelievable. And everything she says is probably very questionable because she supports the unions. She supports Obama. That's all she cares about. She doesn't care about any Republican. She wants Republican groups investigated. That's her spiel. So
okay. Well, let's get a response to those two things. Are you an Obama supporter? Do you support Democrats? Are you liberal? And do you only go after Republicans?
Crew is a nonpartisan organization, and we've taken on politicians on both sides of the aisle who've had ethical issues, and money in politics is something that we're concerned about across the board.
Ralph, Brockton, Massachusetts, Democratic caller.
Yeah, hello.
Hi, Ralph.
My name is Ralph. I live in Massachusetts. I definitely think that Melanie Sloan is exactly right with you guys and Citizens United versus the FEC. And my opinion is we have to realize, Democrat or Republican, I mean, let's face it, it's really a lot of baloney right now. And I think Democrat and Republicans should realize Citizens United is very, very impressive in the last 4 years. The fourth anniversary is now, I guess. And versus the FEC, I think that's fundamental to our liberties. You know, it's one of our main liberties to do what Melanie Sloan has been saying on TV. I really agree with it.
Okay. All right, Ralph.
Well, thank you so much for your remarks. I really appreciate it. I think one of the things that is challenging is to convey to all Americans how much the money in politics affects them. The fact is, no matter what issue you care about today, whether it's student loans, health care, the economy, banking, every single one of those is impacted by the incredible amount of money that's anonymously flowing into our political system. And more Americans need to be paying attention to this and making this a first priority issue.
I want to show you the Financial Times this morning. Democratic lawmakers urged to hone their money spinning skills. It says this, that recently, every few months, Democratic members of Congress receive a report from their party committee saying how much money they have raised. But recently, these lengthy documents have contained an extra column that a number of members said they've never seen before, a table rating their fundraising on a new point system. Here's a quote from one congressman. "It's just another way to squeeze us. The system is elaborate, calibrating points according to whom you raise money for, how much, and where you do it, and reflects a hard truth about American politics. The cost of campaigning is continuing to rocket." Here's a quote from George Miller, California Democrat who's going to retire. "Members of Congress would not find it unusual to spend 2, 3, 4 hours out of a day making fundraising calls."
That's exactly right, and I actually think that's on the low end, 2, 3, or 4 hours. I think it's more than that. If you are running for Congress, you win one day, and the very next day you're back out there trying to raise money. And who's most likely to give you money but the people who want something from you? And part of the problem now is after Citizens United, while we know how much money and who the donors are to candidates' campaign committees, when there are these anonymous 501c4s supporting a candidate, we don't know who that money is, and we don't know what the candidate may or may not be trading in order to get that level of support.
The article also says that former Democratic Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle, a Democrat, said typical senators spent 2/3 of the last 2 years of their 6-year term raising money. A senator has to raise $10,000 every day that they're in office, every day of their 6 years, to make the average amount that's spent today in a Senate race.
Right, and it'll be more if you're in a very high-cost media market like New York or California or Philadelphia. Some of those are very, very expensive. So this is a major problem, and most politicians are pretty unhappy about it. They don't want to be spending most of their time raising money, and if they're spending most of their time raising money, then they're not spending their time effectively representing us and worrying about the issues that the people need them to worry about. And we have a lot of challenges facing our country.
Financial Times put these numbers together. The average cost of winning a winning campaign for a House seat was $640,000 in 1998, $1.6 million in 2012. The average cost of a winning campaign for a Senate seat, $4.8 million in 2002, $12 million in 2012. It seems like it's gone up no matter what, even before the Citizens United versus FEC decision.
It absolutely was going up before Citizens United. There's no question that there were more and more creative ways that people were spending money on elections. One of the main benefits of all of this has been to political consultants who've gotten very rich working this system. But that said, it is something that we now should recognize that we need to get under control. The last presidential election was basically a $1 billion campaign. And really, it seems like money could be better spent on more important things than vitriolic television ads.
Well, Steve Tranquility says, what are you afraid of? Why can't anyone with money make ads? You think the public is stupid and can't ID a super PAC ad?
I think the problem isn't that it's a super PAC ad, is that the public doesn't really know who that donor is behind that super PAC ad. And Americans are busy. We're all worrying about getting our kids to school and our work day and all our other problems. We're not sitting there analyzing each ad to say, who put that ad out there and what should I know about them and what might they really want when they're putting this out?
We'll go to Texas next. Tom is joining us there. He's a Republican. Morning, Tom.
Morning, C-SPAN. Thanks for taking my call. Yeah, I just wanted to say every year billions and billions and billions of dollars are spent by these leftist super PACs like ABC, NBC, CBS, PBS, NPR, the New York Times, Washington Post, trying to elect Democrats and defeat Republicans. And since your guest seems to think that money doesn't have anything to do with speech, I was wondering if she'd agree to limit the spending by all these leftist super PACs that I mentioned to maybe $100,000 every year to produce their products, pay their employees, and pay all their other expenses.
Well, the organizations you named are not, in fact, super PACs. They're media organizations, and the rules are very different from them. Super PACs are not the biggest problem we have out there, because at least those super PACs have the donors are named to super PACs. I'd say the biggest problem that we have are actually these 501c4 organizations, which are allegedly supposed to be social welfare organizations. But thanks to a lot of mishandling over at the IRS, these social welfare organizations have basically been allowed to act as political organizations with anonymous money funding our political campaigns.
Keith in Hightstown, New Jersey, independent caller.
Hello, how are you?
Morning, Keith.
Good morning. Really, and nowadays we have to know it's nothing new. You ask the higher up the chain, the chances of a rich man going into heaven, now, the richer you get, the more or less you care about the small people. We know the money is tied to politics. Big, rich donors, billionaires, only donate money for a cause that benefits their cause and their pockets. When you talk about the middle class being separated, well, at the expense of them believing in some of what the politicians sold them out. The middle class, you're going to be poor. There's going to be no middle class. It's called class conflict and control. They kept us blind for so many years. We've never been able to see what the rich and the politicians have been doing and moving forward. This country is definitely in for a bad set. Now, ask Christie the money that he did not give to Trenton for Tony Mack, $100-something million. We had to lay off 112 police officers. A record year of murder in Trenton, New Jersey. Follow the money. Why? Just like he held the money back from Hoboken, just like he held the money back from Fort Lee or whatever. It's just the same.
Okay.
You do as I say or you'll cost.
Melanie Sloan?
Well, certainly there's always an element of political payback in politics when politicians who are elected can take out their anger against people who didn't support them. And obviously that's a problem, and Chris Christie is under federal investigation for exactly that right now, and I think that's a positive thing, and we'll see what comes of that.
Jim wants to know, Melanie, would you be satisfied if donor names were required to be released? Would that help the uninformed voter decide?
That would help wonderfully. That would be a terrific turn of events. And in fact, in Citizens United, the case talked about the need for disclosure and how disclosure would help a great deal. But despite the fact that there's still language about disclosure, we've seen people like Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, who once supported disclosure, who once said, oh, you could have as much money as you want, the important thing is disclosure. Now he's 20 years later, totally backtracked on that and said, no, there shouldn't be disclosure. And that's because he believes that Republicans benefit from the amount of anonymous money going into campaigns. Now, we've seen that, in fact, that didn't work as well as the Republicans thought it would last term. Mitt Romney, despite all of the anonymous money coming in and the huge amounts that he had, didn't win. And President Obama also had a lot of money coming into his campaign as well and into organizations that supported him. So I think we may see some Republicans joining with Democrats in talking about the need for disclosure. But right now, it's sort of been an element of practically the Republican Party platform that there should be no disclosure, that anonymous money is fine. And Justice Scalia has previously said that you need to have the courage of your convictions. Yes, you have a right to engage in political speech, but you don't have a right to do it anonymously. You should have to be identified. And if you think your views are so good and would promote the benefit of the American people, then you should be proud of that and you should have your identity released.
Well, then, isn't that the key there? I mean, why hasn't there been legislation to address that right there?
Well, there has been legislation to address that right there, and that's called the Disclose Act, and that has been supported by...
Say, why hasn't it been signed into law?
It's never passed, it can't pass the House because Republicans don't support it in the House of Representatives.
Well, Steve Tranquility wants to know, would you say the money influence is equally distributed on both sides? One side more virtuous than the other?
I wouldn't say that anybody's virtuous in this game. I think that's the one thing probably everybody could agree on. There's not a lot of virtue in these vituperative political ads. And the money hasn't been completely evenly distributed. There is far more anonymous money on the right because they believe in less disclosure. Now, there are certainly Democrats who have contributed to these anonymous groups, and that's unacceptable as well. But I think that the Democrats' view has been, although they totally support disclosure and many of their donors support disclosure, they're not going to just disarm unilaterally and not support the same kind of organizations that the Republicans are supporting, because if they did, then the Republicans would win hands down. So we have this kind of escalating warfare going on that's really harming just all of us, the regular Americans.
We'll go to Robert next in Vail, Arizona, Democratic caller. Hi, Robert.
Good morning. Good morning. How's everybody this morning?
Doing well.
I'd like to take about 20 seconds, first of all, before my comment, to explain our names. We live in Vail, Arizona. We meet here very early because we're brothers, and our name is Genius Robert, Genius Bob, Genius Robbie, and, so there's 5 brothers, and most of the time there's 4 of us that meet here, and we're all genius, Robert, and how I explained. But what I'd like to say is how the Supreme Court has really mangled the Constitution, and I'll explain it. Okay, the Constitution, when you read the preamble, it is done for the American people, okay, which at first were the Americans, which were the people that were here. There were, Native Americans and, evolution changed.
Hey, Robert,
all that.
I need you to get to your point.
Okay, well, my point is how the Supreme Court has been essentially criminal by allowing all this foreign money from foreign entities and foreign corporations, even though a lot of them are from the USA. That is foreign money.
Okay, well, let's talk about that.
There are questions about how much foreign money is going into our campaigns. There is a prohibition on that still exists, that foreign money can't be spent on political campaigns. You can't solicit from foreigners for your candidate committee, and they shouldn't be supporting campaigns. That said, a lot of corporations are multinational, and it is very hard to say when you are a corporation abroad, but you have a U.S.-based, a large U.S.-based center, whether or not the money is really foreign or not. And so I think that there are some real questions remaining about how to deal with this problem.
Boring File Clerk says, if money isn't a form of speech, how would you define freedom of speech?
Well, I think the freedom of speech is the right of citizens and other people to speak their minds freely, and the right to associate freely. But saying that a corporation is like a person and has its own specific rights to free speech, I think that's where the court really goes too far.
Kathy in Marina, California, Republican caller.
Hello.
Morning.
Good morning. I think a lot of these groups want to stay anonymous because they're vilified more so than socialist, liberal groups. They get a free pass and are not as thoroughly investigated or put forth into the public. I remember during the shutdown when Obama and Reid would not negotiate, that Elizabeth Warren said no less than, I believe, 12 times that Republicans were anarchists. And if you look up the word anarchists, that's a pretty strong word. And Democrats have said that babies would starve and old people would die. And it's a constant thing on Capitol Hill and in the media, and it's just constant. So, that makes total sense that they want to stay anonymous. Also, I think it just balances things out. There was a guy who called and talked about all the money that gets funneled in for the liberals and the socialists through ABC, NBC, CBS, PBS, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I go so far as to say all major magazines, all the major popular music, all the television shows and the television stations, most of all the large corporations and their commercials that they put out, plus all the educators in the public schools and in the universities, plus all the news editors and all the newspaper magazines. Pretty much everything that's out there in society does have a liberal socialist bent.
Okay, Kathy, Melanie Sloan, what do you make?
Well, I think that's simply not true. I think we're seeing a lot of robust debate in our society, and the country seems fairly evenly split between Republican and Democrat. The Republicans control the House of Representatives. And certainly they're making their voices heard every day. So it doesn't seem like there's a lack of ability to spend money and elect Republican leaders.
What have we heard from Senator John McCain on moving forward now that the court decided Citizens United versus FEC? Everybody knows John McCain, Russ Feingold, two senators, different perspectives, came together for campaign finance reform back in early 2000s.
Well, yes, and Senator McCain was once a huge advocate of campaign finance reform, and then really during his last election, he quieted down, and you didn't hear him talking about campaign finance reform anymore, and that's because Republicans overwhelmingly are not supportive of campaign finance regulations. So I think that Mr. McCain more recently has suggested that he does see the problem of money in politics again, but I'm not sure that he's prepared to be a leader on this issue at this time.
What about the president's administration? What could he do by executive decision, or what can the FEC do, the SEC?
Well, I'm so glad you asked that, because there are so many things that could be done that haven't been done. One of the major things that could happen is the IRS needs to fix its regulations. By statute, 501c4s were supposed to be engaged exclusively in the social welfare of Americans. But now, thanks to an IRS regulation, they've changed exclusively, they've defined exclusively to be primarily, to say that these social welfare organizations must just primarily be working for the social welfare. And that has been taken to mean that 49% of their money can be spent on political activity. That regulation alone can be changed. And now that there has been a lot of controversy over the past few months about 501c4s, starting with the last July, when there was this issue about had the IRS been targeting Tea Party groups who were for 501c4s. Now the administration has proposed some regulations to look at 501c4s, but sadly they're not addressing the issue of exclusively versus primarily. Crew, by the way, has a lawsuit against the IRS over the definition problem between exclusively and primarily, and we've asked the IRS to change this rule and go back to the original meaning of exclusively. So that's one thing that can happen. The FEC has been a disaster. This is the organization charged with monitoring our elections, and basically it's been dysfunctional for many, many years. One of the things President Obama could do but hasn't done is appoint more new commissioners. He finally appointed 2, but there are many others whose terms have expired and remain there anyway. So we need a vigorous FEC that is willing to at least enforce the campaign finance laws that are on the books, and we have not seen that happening recently. And finally, with the SEC had its opportunity to put on its agenda this rule that would have required more political contribution disclosure from corporations, and recently just tabled it and said it wasn't going to consider that right now. And that was very sad, because this proposed SEC regulation had hundreds of thousands of supportive comments, more than anything else in the SEC's history, and yet still they tabled it.
Here's an email from one of our viewers, from Lori in Indianapolis. Term limits would help solve this problem. Politicians will not spend such a large portion of their time raising money for their next campaign if we limit them to 1 or 2 terms in office.
Well, I think there are problems with having members of Congress only in terms for 1 or 2 years. If you're in the House of Representatives, that's a very short time. You're not going to learn much about how the institution runs. And one of the things we do need is for people to work there for a while, not always be saying that Washington is this terrible place, because we need Washington to work effectively. And that means legislators have to get to know each other, talk to each other, and compromise. And I don't think you can get to that if legislators are only here very brief periods.
And another email from Mike in Colorado. Can states limit contributions to their residents?
Well, states can't limit their residents' contributions to federal elections, no. But one of the things we are seeing is states trying to implement their own kinds of campaign finance regulations, particularly for state elections. And we're also seeing it in cities. So we're seeing, because the federal government has so failed to take the problem of money in politics seriously and pass campaign finance regulations, you are seeing at the lower level, at the state level, and at the city level, you are seeing efforts to deal with this problem.
Ken's next in Mobile, Alabama, independent caller. Hey, Ken, you're on the air.
Morning, ladies. How are we doing?
Morning.
I just wanted to thank Ms. Sloan for the wonderful job she's doing, keeping the American people informed. And what I really wanted to say is I think Citizens United is a reflection of the 1% here in America. Keeping everything secretly. So people are not knowing who's behind what's going on in America. And, who's, basically, money.
Okay. All right, Ken, we'll go to Derek next in Pennsylvania, independent caller. Hi, Derek.
Hello, name's Eric, actually. My question is, obviously I'm speaking with someone who's very educated on the topic, and that my question is decidedly vague. With the money involved in politics today, will there ever be an era when we have politicians that see themselves serving in office as a privilege to the country? This is a very vague question. As I know it, I mean, George Washington couldn't even pay for his cab ride to his own inauguration.
Melanie Sloan.
Well, I do think that there are politicians who are committed to working for a better America and for a better living for all Americans. So I don't think that we could just write off all politicians, but I do think it's a major problem when politicians have to spend most of their time looking for campaign cash, and inevitably it is just human nature to be more supportive of the people who support you. So if there are people out there who are donating to these politicians or helping them fend off attacks, when those folks want something, politicians just naturally, like all other people, are going to be grateful for the assistance, and they're going to give those people a closer listen when they have problems. And that really affects so many Americans. I mean, we saw during the effort to regulate the banking industry after the crash in 2008, we saw Dick Durbin, a senator from Illinois, say, we can't pass anything because the banks, they own the place. And we've seen in the past pharmaceutical companies who have huge numbers of registered lobbyists and make large contributions also to campaigns. We've seen a lack of ability to regulate the cost of prescription drugs, for example, and that too is because of the problem of money in politics.
Back to the Financial Times piece this morning on campaigning. It says Mr. Obama had the resources to defend himself against the new giants of the campaign landscape, those super PACs, which have no caps on the money they can raise from individual donors. Members of Congress, by contrast, can solicit a maximum of $2,600 from each individual donor for each election they face, potentially putting them at the mercy of hostile super PACs. Mr. Miller, George Miller, congressman from California, said when he was first elected 40 years ago, quote, most of your fundraising was done in your districts from your constituents, the people you were hoping to represent. Today, I would say that in most districts, you can't even begin to raise enough money when you're going up against a super PAC or a combination of them.
That's exactly right. And if you check out most members of Congress's fundraising, you'll find that most of the money they raise doesn't, in fact, come from their states. It comes from the industries they regulate. So, for example, if a member of Congress is on the Agriculture Committee, they're going to get tons of money from big agribusiness. And similarly, if they're on defense appropriations, you're going to see most of their money coming from defense contractors. And you have to wonder if, when those members of Congress are regulating those industries, they're a little softer on those who are giving them so much money and helping them stay in office.
Dee Frederick says, how many PACs with special interests are promoting this TPP trade deal? Who benefits? We know it's not the American worker.
I don't know how many organizations are involved, but there are always so many involved. And the big problem is we'll see these organizations and they'll have names for like the American Action Network. And what does that mean, American Action Network? Who's really behind the American Action Network? We know it's run by former Senator Republican Norm Coleman, but we really don't know where it gets its money or what the point of view of the very wealthy people and corporations that fund it, why they're funding it, and what they hope to get.
Governor Norm Coleman from Minnesota, right?
No, Senator Norm Coleman from Minnesota.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. We'll go on to Rocky in Newcastle, Pennsylvania. Independent caller. Go ahead.
Good morning. Yeah, I agree with this, Ms. Sloan, that this has been a disaster. That I don't know how the Supreme Court even made this decision that that corporations could be individuals. So, what would it take to overturn this by the Constitution, or not by the Congress? And I think that there's been said that the weak link is the part of the government that really has to be, watched carefully. So I'll listen to her comments.
Well, the Supreme Court had the chance to reconsider Citizens United a couple of years ago when the Montana Supreme Court in another case had said that money is corrupting. Money has a corrupting influence, and it was talking really about the Copper King's influence in the state of Montana. And the Supreme Court refused to take up that case and consider the problem that we have. So it's going to be a long-standing problem, and that's why there are people focused on a constitutional amendment. Some of these things can't be fixed merely by legislation because the Supreme Court has elevated this to a constitutional issue.
We'll go to Edward, Greenbelt, Maryland, Democratic caller. Hi, Edward.
Good morning, Beretta, and your guest, Ms. Melanie Sloan, for responsibility and ethics. I think you're doing a wonderful job, and I wish I could multiply your efforts 1,000 times. And our media, like MSNBC, you're well-researched, and you do your homework, and you do your fact-checking. And, you have the right to your own opinions, but not your own facts. And Melanie and Ms. Beretta, you talked to me before. I've been African American. I'm a concerned scientist and a PhD scientist, and I did my studies, a lot of studies in Europe, and I have a fresh view of the world. I'm concerned, Beretta, and also Melanie. I'm very concerned when you look at the right-wing power machines on these Clear Channel AM broadcast facilities blasting information all over the country. They have high-power, long-wave amplitude modulation systems. This is unfair, and these systems are funded by people you don't even know who's funding these guys. And Melanie, I will let you look into this. But when I listen to callers on MSNBC, people are calling in. They are uninformed. They may be innocent people, but you drive across this country and you listen to your radio. All you pick up is some of these powerful machines, and people are being bombarded by this stuff.
So, Edward, what's your question?
My question is, how can you write this stuff? If we don't do something about this, our country could run in the wrong direction.
Well, I think that's exactly right. And in some sense, in America, we get the government we deserve. We all have the right to vote, and our elections are free and mostly fair, although I think there's really been some questions about the fairness in the past few years. But we have to be more engaged citizenry. We have to take action. We have to tell our politicians that we're not happy about the amount of time that they're spending raising money every day. We're not happy about the fact that they go off to Vail and have campaign events, in ski resorts or in Boca Raton when it's cold. We want them to spend their time not just raising money, but working on our interests. And right now, I think many of them would say, I'm not so happy with the system either, but it's got to change. But that's going to require a concerted effort by Americans, because politicians really only change when we as Americans demand that they do.
Pablo's our last call. Miami, Florida, Republican caller. Go ahead. You're on the air with Melanie Sloan.
Hello.
Morning. Go ahead.
Yes. The only thing that matters is the ad true. It doesn't matter who puts the ad out. If the ad is false, they should, jump on that person jump on that ad for being false. It doesn't matter who puts it out there. And if I'm speaking now, should my name and my address be put because I have an opinion? No. I have a right to privacy, and they all have a right to privacy. As long as the ad is true, it's a good ad. And that's all I have to say.
One of the problems that we've seen is the ads really aren't true, and there are organizations that have been set up, like PolitiFact, that evaluates ads and says that they're false. But the fact is, very few people will see the PolitiFact website to review what the ad's content was and the truth or fiction about the ad. But that doesn't stop the ad from running over and over and over again. And often politicians will sort of disassociate themselves with particularly vituperative and misleading ads, and they'll say, "Well, I had nothing to do with that ad. It was put out by the super PAC." But the fact is that ad still supported that politician, and Americans really don't understand that there was a lot of false information in those ads.
By the way, in political news this morning, Miami Herald reports that Jim Messina, who was President Obama's campaign director in 2012, has joined the gubernatorial campaign of Charlie Crist down in Florida. Melanie Sloan with the Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, thank you very much for being here. Appreciate your time as always.
Oh, it was my pleasure.
Coming up next, we'll talk to a supporter of Citizens United case, election law expert Hans von Spakovsky of the Heritage Foundation, and then later, economist Mark Zandi on his predictions of which states will see the biggest job growth in 2012. But first, a news update from C-SPAN Radio.
It's 8:30 a.m. Eastern Time. Well, Secretary of State John Kerry is headed to Switzerland for an international conference on ending the crisis in Syria. This after a last-minute decision to cancel Iran's participation in the meeting. The United Nations invited Iran on Sunday, but disinvited it yesterday after the U.S. and some of its allies and the Syrian opposition protested its inclusion. Russia's foreign minister said earlier today that the decision to disinvite Iran was a mistake, but not a catastrophe. Meanwhile, Russian security officials say they're hunting 3 so-called black widows they believe are in the country. Officials are concerned they could be targeting the Olympics. One of the 3 potential female suicide bombers is believed to be in the Olympic city of Sochi. The women are the wives of previous suicide bombers. The Center for Strategic and International Studies is focusing on security at the upcoming Olympics in a discussion that is beginning right now, and you can watch it on C-SPAN 2 or hear it at 10 on C-SPAN Radio. And this tweet from CBS News Chief White House correspondent Mark Knoller. He's writing this morning that the president is planning to travel to Europe in March. The trip begins with the Nuclear Security Summit in the Netherlands from March 24th and 25th, then to Brussels on March 26th for the US-EU Summit. And then the president will meet with the Pope at the Vatican. And in a statement, the president says that he, quote, looks forward to discussing with Pope Francis their shared commitment to fighting poverty and growing inequality, close quote. And those are some of the latest headlines on C-SPAN Radio.
Did I feel prepared? Yes.